So there was an incident in which the Ku Klux came in to shoot up the black section of town, and Williams and his cronies were there and, of course, shot out their tires. They didn't kill anybody, but those people that were used to terrorizing got the idea and ran away. And this was well before the Deacons for Defense and later the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Well, sadly, of course, suddenly the FBI and all the law authorities who had for a century ignored the activities of the racists, the Ku Klux Klan, and the lynchers, suddenly discovered that this was terrible and began persecuting him. And he wrote a book called Negroes with Guns, which came to my attention, and I decided to invite him to speak at Yale. Now, we had, as I may have mentioned, a socialist club at Yale called the George Orwell Forum, and we had invited many, many speakers to Yale, labor leaders and leftists, and Eric Fromm, the psychologist, who was also a socialist, and so we had a good following. So I invited Robert Williams, and then I printed up a flyer that said Negroes with Guns, and on the Sunday before the meeting I went down Dixwell Avenue, which was then the main street of the black section of New Haven, and I handed them out at churches as people came out, because in those days the black community was definitely church-centered, and so as to bring more people to this meeting. Well, when the college found out about it, they went through the ceiling, and Dean Devane called me into his office in this wonderful Gothic building, a vast office with carpets and pictures of old Yaleys on the walls and so on. Mr. Greeman, and so on. And don't you think there'll be violence or damage or something like that? And I said, Dean Devane, I give you my word as a gentleman, there'll be no violence. And of course, this stopped the poor man dead in his tracks, because this was Yale, and he had really nothing else to say. And then, because I was feeling in a kindly mood, I said, Dean Devane, don't you remember, I was a senior then, when we were freshmen, your opening address, and this was true, I have a good memory, where you said that we should go off campus and make friends with the community around Yale, which of course is all black, or was in those days. So that there was nothing else they could do. And so the night arrived, and the auditorium was filled, and more than half the people there were black. Unfortunately, Robert Williams had just fled the country for Cuba because it had gotten too much for him. And they sent a substitute, which was his lawyer, a black man named, oh dear me, it's in the book. And so I thought, well, okay, he'll speak up and so on and talk about the problems of black people in this country. But instead, it turned out that he was a Castroite and completely deviated the subject of the thing after briefly saying that Robert Williams had fled to Cuba. Instead of talking about his own career as a black lawyer or Robert Williams and what he represented, it began praising Castro in Cuba, which was, I suppose, okay, although Cuba was beginning to show signs that the revolution was not as beautiful as we had hoped at the beginning. But this was off the subject. So I was the chair, and I reined him in as quickly as possible and said, well, let's get back to the point. And I improvised a little speech talking about discrimination in New Haven and the banks downtown and the real estate problems and the terrible conditions under which blacks were, and saying that we need to do something about the problem right here and right now. And when with that, a man stood up in the audience, a black guy in his 40s, and he introduced himself as the president of the local NAACP, and who was also, it turned out, a factory worker and a Korean vet. And he said, "Oh, I think you're absolutely right, and we have to do something." And in his speech, he talked about the problem in New Haven, which was the progressives, the Kennedy people, Mayor Lee, and the left-wing progressives. Back in New Haven in 1960, they were introducing the Model Cities program, the first pilot project for what they called urban renewal, and which we perceived as Negro removal. And so, and of course, there were the bourgeois elements in the black community, the politicians and some of the preachers who were going along with that in return for favors, like land in the when they cut everything up, that they would get a place for a new church and this and that and the other perk. So he issued a challenge and said, "We'll do this with the NECP or outside of it," because he was an upstart and a working man rather than the usual professional class that was reformist and opportunistic and sometimes dominated that organization. And indeed, that's what happened. And we formed a core chapter, the Congress of Racial Equality, which had sponsored the Freedom Rides and was much more activist-oriented. And among the people that joined it was Eleanor Holmes, now Eleanor Holmes Norton, the representative for the District of Columbia in Congress, and many other people. And this culminated in the famous sit-out of 1962 in New Haven, when, in opposition to the Oak Street Connector, that terrible concrete dagger in the heart of the black community that just penetrated right into the heart of New Haven and separated Yale from the rest of the people. The people, instead of sitting in, sat out in Dixwell Avenue, and everybody put their furniture in the street and sat around and blocked traffic. And that was an important stage of struggle. Unfortunately, we didn't prevail, and you can see in all of these now cities that are, Connecticut is the second richest state in the Union, with 3 of the 10 poorest cities. Hartford, the second richest city after Beverly Hills. New Haven, with Yale University, the largest corporation in the state of Connecticut, whose endowment grew during the recent crisis, according to my alumni magazine. And of course, Bridgeport, which was once a socialist municipality. So this urban renewal was disastrous for people all over.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.